Hi, my name is Eliot Cohen. I am the Burke Chair in Strategy here at CSIS, and it gives me great pleasure to welcome two guests to discuss a fascinating and important new book, The Strategists by Phillips O'Brien. So let me begin by introducing our author. Professor O'Brien is a professor and the head of the School of International Relations at St. Andrews University. He's also a non-resident senior associate with the Burke Chair here at CSIS, so he's part of the family. Professor O'Brien has a long and distinguished record. He's the author of a number of books, probably two of the most prominent of which I would say are one on World War II, How the War Was Won, which really, I think, challenges a lot of our assumptions about World War II and why it ended the way it did. And another, the second most important man in the world, which is a biography of Admiral William Leahy, who was President Roosevelt's chief of staff during World War II, who he argues was really a much more important figure than is normally considered to be. And our other guest is my friend and colleague, Dr. Kori Schake. Dr. Schake is the director of the Foreign and Defense Policy Program at the American Enterprise Institute, with which we have a friendly rivalry. Dr. Schake has a remarkable career in government service, in the Department of State, in the White House. She is, as I said, the director of the Foreign Policy and Defense Program at AEI. She's also a very accomplished historian with, among other things, a wonderful book called Safe Passage, which is about the transition between British and American dominance in the international system. And we're here to discuss this book. So welcome to you both. Phil, I'm particularly glad to have you in town for another reason. We're taking advantage of your presence to discuss the book. The two of us are together launching a study of analysis of the Russian and Ukrainian militaries just before the full-scale Russian invasion. But that's a separate topic. We're going to deal with that tomorrow. Today we're here to talk about the strategists. So Phil, maybe to get us launched, could you just tell us what's the origin story of the book and what's its basic argument?
The origin, I mean, I tend to be slow on these things. So the origins for all my books are, I look at something that doesn't make sense and I stew on it for a few years. And then I feel the book comes out. The origins of this were writing How the War Was Won, which was published in 2015 and actually took me about a decade to write. And it was while I was researching and writing How the War Was Won, I came across, well, I didn't come across, but I started looking at the Germany First policy that the US was supposedly following. The grand strategy of the US in terms of allocation of equipment was called Germany First, Europe First. And actually, as I went in and studied the equipment, where everything was made and where it went, it was clear there was no Germany First. It was a stated strategy. It was in documents. It was even expressed verbally, this is our strategy. But there was no attempt in the slightest to enforce it. There was no attempt to monitor it, to say this was Germany First. In fact, if you look at the equipment and where it goes, what the US makes, it's really a 50-50 war between Europe and the Pacific. And so I thought, well, what the heck? Why is that? Why do we assume there's this strategy and there's not? And that started me thinking on a few things. One, if you have to write a strategy down, it's because you're not that important. The leaders don't write their strategies. The Roosevelts, the Hitlers, the Churchills, they very rarely have to write anything down because they're making a decision. So we want to go look at what they're doing and deciding. And indeed, so from looking at Roosevelt, if you look at what Roosevelt was doing, he was very much crafting the war in his own image of how a war should be fought. And it was very much his own personal inclinations. It wasn't Germany First. He was very happy to have this balanced war for a combination of both political reasons and you might say strategic reasons. And a lot of that, both of those come out of the First World War era. It was clear to me. One, the strategic, from his own view of the war, from a Mahanite view of the First World War and his own experiences in France, and also politically from a very telling experience right at the end of the war when he runs for vice president, which I think people don't pay enough attention to. When he runs for vice president in 1920 and is humiliated, he is, from that point, probably the most hyper-political person when it comes to foreign and strategic policy. that he is doing, and he's not going to do anything in his mind that is politically too risky. And that's why actually he likes the balanced war.
So, but to be clear, I mean, the book is about Roosevelt. I think a lot of American readers will be particularly interested in it. It's also about Adolf Hitler, Stalin, Mussolini, and Churchill. So why did you decide to write a book not just about Roosevelt, who is an endlessly fascinating character, to be sure, but throwing in those four as well?
Because it was interesting, of course, how they all have that experience, you might say, comes together in the First World War. At one point, actually, 3 of them or 4 of them are quite close. That Churchill is in London, Hitler is at the Western Front, Roosevelt comes over in 1918, Mussolini is in Milan at that point, having just come from the front. So they're actually all in a relatively small area. Fighting the First World War, and Stalin is at that point rising to power. So they're all sort of in these quite interesting positions. And I thought it would be interesting to see how they viewed war. Because the First World War wasn't just a war, it was the war. We sometimes now gets overshadowed by the Second World War. But for them, this was the Great War. They viewed it as the war that would transform the world, or that would that had the greatest impact on their vision. So I think we can't underestimate that war's impact. And so I wanted to see what they were thinking. And the more I read about it, what's interesting, they start saying the same things in 1914, 15, 16, 17, as they say exactly in 1939, 40, 41, 42. And so it was making that connection.
Yeah. Well, you say if we want to understand strategy, we must also understand the strategist. And I think we'll put that quote up there. Okay, Kori, have at him. I should explain we're all friends and colleagues, which means we agreed we're not going to let him off easy. Because as Kori said, that would be disrespectful. So.
Yeah. Totally true. So first, a softball question.
Sure.
I love Ernest May's book, Strange Victory, about the German invasion of France and why it succeeded. And what I always take away from that book is that he agrees with your point that you have to understand the strategist. He thought the reason Blitzkrieg worked so well against France was that the Wehrmacht rightly understood the risk intolerance of the French leadership. How much do these 5 strategists that you look at think about each other's strategy?
Well, a lot of them did. You would say certainly Hitler and Stalin thought a lot about each other. That they're both trying to, I mean, when they signed the Nazi-Soviet pact, there's a question of whether either of them thought it would last very long. So that they do think about each other strategically. Churchill thinks constantly about how to appeal to Roosevelt's sense of strategy and make it work for the British Empire. Mussolini, I think, is probably just desperately trying to appeal to Hitler. So they don't think about, everyone thinks about the other 5, but at least they think about at least one or 2 or 3 more.
It's a series of dyads.
It's a series of relationships. Certainly Stalin thinks a lot about Roosevelt. That he's much more than he thinks about Churchill. He's desperate to appeal to Roosevelt. So he does view Roosevelt strategically as a bit closer, certainly when it comes to how the war should be won, than he believes he is with Churchill. So they all have an interesting relationship with each other and how they view. Hitler thinks he understands Roosevelt and Churchill, but he doesn't. I mean, Hitler's the remarkable one because he thinks he knows everything, and actually he knows very little. But
what I took away from that section of the book, so my theory of what makes for a good strategist is that every great strategist is a desperate paranoiac. Because if you're not worried that a trap door is going to open underneath you and you're going to be falling into the sewer below the building, you're not practicing strategy. And your description of Hitler was just astonishing. Germany did so well for so long when he was so blithely confident that he was smarter than everybody else.
Well, but okay, let me push back a little bit. I mean, isn't it the case that he was? I mean, he could not read Churchill. I think that's very clear. He did read Chamberlain and Daladier quite well. I mean, there's that famous episode where he says, I've met my enemies at Munich. They are worms, which is harsh.
True.
But and even the Chamberlain, he may have misread slightly, but I think he did sense their weakness. I mean, my feeling particularly about the dictators, and this is a general statement, not just a one about these three is that they have to have an incredible instinct for other people's weaknesses. And I think that in a way is also part of the story of Hitler's success, that his ability to appeal to people, and probably Mussolini's as well. And of course, Stalin absolutely plays on weakness and fear. Maybe, I mean, one of the lessons may be that to be a good strategist, you cannot simply be focused on other people's weaknesses. I don't know if
That's a nice point.
I think that's a good way of putting it. I think maybe Hitler loses that ability as the war goes on and he becomes more obsessed with his own individual vision.
Well, isn't there a larger point there as well, which is something I've often wondered about, and you and I, Kori, have talked about from our time together in government. The longer you're high up in government, my feeling is the worse your sense of reality gets. and that's true of American presidents. But it's probably way more true if you are a warlord, the supreme commander of a country engaged in a titanic conflict. I mean, just what that does to your psyche, I think has to be extraordinary.
I was actually thinking about that as I was reading the book, because one of the dogs that does not bark in this is ideology. You're quite critical at some points of Roosevelt not using his political capital to join the war.
Yep.
And I read that slightly differently, but the constraints he was under in a democratic system are so different than what 3 of the 5 were under.
Well, to ram that home, actually, let me call up another quote. Roosevelt was probably the greatest success of all the grand strategists in the ways and means of modern war. So, let's put that on the docket here too. You really do put FDR up on a...
Though I do knock him down at other times. I mean, I start from a few fundamental things where we have to say, first of all, what armed forces would you like to fight in? I'd like to fight in the U.S. Armed Forces, because your chance of dying are the smallest. Now, why is that? Why is actually your chance of dying in the U.S. Armed Forces far smaller than any other armed force, and considering the amount they fight? That's because Roosevelt equips you so well, partly out of the democratic war-making issue. But he has this way of understanding machines are going to win the war. I'm not going to win the war by throwing my soldiers in brave attacks and dangerous objects. And that is actually something I don't think he gets enough credit for. I think we sometimes overlook the fact that the United States suffers fewer casualties than Yugoslavia.
Well, as I recall in the book, it's on a per capita basis, though. So the magnitude of the American population reduces.
No, Yugoslavia suffers more than 400,000 dead.
Oh, so it's an absolute, not a relative measure.
That's an absolute.
But isn't that also because, FDR is president of what is by far the world's greatest industrial power at the time? And so, I guess I'll throw up one more quote, and then I'll stop with this. Grand strategy in World War II is far more personal than we might believe. The idea of there being a clear and logical national strategy remains a positivist dream, but an actual myth. And there's a lot to unpack there, so I may want to keep it up for a little bit. But can't you say it is natural for the United States to resort to a kind of machine-intensive strategy, because that's who we are? And even see some foreshadowing of this in the Civil War on the Union side.
Yeah, so Russell Weigley and others argue that the American way of war is technology. One of my favorite parts of your book, Phillips, was that that's actually not really true, that the Germans are going for the best high-quality tank, heavy. They don't believe in mobility, they believe in technology. And the Americans flood the zone with cheap knockoffs. But the magnitude of it has momentum. I thought that was a really important part of your argument.
Well, he fights with mass and technology. They're very happy to have the compromise between mass and technology. They're not going to go just for the boutique or the exquisite. They're going to go for the really good that they can make in mass numbers. And what Roosevelt does is he is confronted a number of times in the war with the decision of, do I want to take a risky operation that might lead to a lot of dead? We were talking it earlier, say a 43 invasion of France. And he always says, no, there's no point. There's no point to take these risks because we are going to win the war. I mean, Roosevelt, I think, understands very clearly they're going to win. That's not the question for him. The United States is not going to be conquered. And once the Soviet Union is going to survive and Britain's going to survive, they're going to win the war. So he does it in such a way, and I have a lot of respect for this, that he is trying to keep his army to the minimum number of casualties throughout. Germany, as the second largest economy, it has mass casualties. So having a large economy there's no correlation between the size of the economy and the casualties. It is the US which suffers these very small casualty numbers.
So can I draw you out on Roosevelt? And in particular, I have the impression that Roosevelt was a lot more nervous about the outcome of the war than you described just now. And that he thought part of the reason for a Europe first strategy, which I hope we'll come to because you don't think there is one, and that's a really interesting part of the book. Part of the argument for a Europe first strategy is that if either Britain or the Soviet Union capitulate, there's no aggregation of countries that can prevent Nazi domination of Eurasia.
Well, you've hit on a really good point, Kori. There is a written down Europe first strategy, which comes from the point before the US goes into the war, when they do wonder whether the Soviet Union and Britain will actually make it. And at that point, when they're talking about Rainbow and fighting the world, you could definitely say, yes, they understand at that point they have to go for Germany first. But when the US gets into the war, things look a little bleak with the Soviet Union, but the Soviet Union's not out. Britain is under no real threat in late 1941, early 1942. So he can be much more relaxed than they are when they're gaming 1940 and Rainbow fighting the world. That's what I mean about when Germany first is originally written down, the situation could be more bleak than it is actually when the US goes in. And by the summer of 42, they know the Soviet Union's going to make it almost certainly.
Can I ask a question, though, in a way it gets to the larger theme of the book? You do make the sounds that this is all emanating from out of FDR's head. But don't the institutions play a role? I mean, and don't get me wrong, because I think the book is, first, it's wonderfully written, and so
Yes,
it's a rattling good read on top of everything else. And I think it's a very useful corrective to the idea that is frequently out there, which is that politicians don't matter and individual leaders don't matter. When I fervently believe that they absolutely do matter, but. Do you think you might have gone a little bit too far in saying that, well, so we can take the American case, but you can actually take
the others,
any of the other cases. Why did the Germans build the kind of army they do and fight the war the way they do? Well, you can make a certain argument. This is sort of the way the German general staff operated, the way they thought about war. It's not entirely surprising that they got the army that they got. Given away kind of a certain kind of American rationalism, it's not surprising that we decided to build an army with 90 divisions, and we end up deploying, I think, all but one of them, because we're going to get the manpower things just right. And I mean, do you think that the institutional structures and cultures are just kind of epiphenomenal, or to use a $64 word?
I thought about this a lot, but I can't see where they stop. If one of the grand strategists really wants to do something, what I don't see is the bureaucracy able to stop them. I mean, in the most extreme case, Stalin is not stopped from doing whatever he wants at any time. Eventually, he learns to rein it in himself as a grand strategist. But up 41, 42, he is even trying to dabble in the battle.
Churchill is frequently braked on things like an invasion of Norway, or even early on, sending more airplanes to the French as they're going down the tubes. Or there are all kinds of operations that he would have loved that he lets himself be talked out of by the chiefs.
Churchill is actually probably the one where the bureaucracy has the greatest power. But even then, I would argue Churchill ultimately fights the war he wants, and what stops him in the end is the United States. So Churchill is the one who would be the weakest, you would say, in the bureaucratic structure. That he does have certain things. Allenbrook thwarts him at different times, different members of the general staff. But even then, he still does fight the war. He doesn't want to get involved with the Pacific. He doesn't get involved with the Pacific when the United States puts pressure on him.
But don't they offer forces after the end of the European campaign? Because King and others turn them down, right? Because they don't want to associate us with their imperial holdings.
Although they did have carriers off of Okinawa. They had armored decks, so they could actually deal with the kamikazes better than ours could.
You're absolutely right, Kori. King wanted to turn them down, but Roosevelt said, no, you're going to take them. So this happens at the Second Quebec in 1944, and the British are saying, with the war in Europe winding down, we're preparing a British Pacific Fleet, and King's like, I don't want you, stay away. And Roosevelt says to them, no, you're going to have the carriers. So they do send the British Pacific Fleet, but King is always very careful to keep it from playing any kind of central role where in his mind the British could claim any role in the victory. King does not want this to be a victory for anyone but the U.S. Navy.
And he hated the Royal Navy. I mean, that's why he insisted the uniform be a completely different uniform and all that.
So my favorite portrait in the National Portrait Gallery is of Ernest King, and it portrays him on a hilltop overlooking the reconstituted fleet in Pearl Harbor. And his teeth are clenched, his fists are clenched. You can see the vein throbbing down his forehead. And it has this magnificent placard quoting his daughter saying, "My father was maligned as a man of voluble temper. Nothing could be further from the truth. He was, in fact, the most even-tempered man I have ever known, for he was always in a rage."
Yep, it's a great quote.
So I have a question about the five.
Yep.
Why does Mussolini make the cut?
Well, because he has enormous power in Italy. And there are two fateful decisions for Italy in the war, and he makes them. One is he doesn't have to decide to go into the war in 1940, but he does. In fact, oddly, Mussolini makes one of the best decisions of any of the strategists in September 39, August 39, when he stays out. Hitler expects him to come in, is basing his war plans on coming in, and Mussolini actually makes a proper judgment in September 1939. I can't be sure Germany's going to win. My military isn't ready. And he disappoints Hitler. Hitler almost calls off the invasion of Poland at that point. But then it's Mussolini who can't contain himself in May 1940, when he's like, oh my God, the Germans are actually going to win. I've got to go in. And that was him. There was no press. If he didn't want to do it, he didn't have to. But he says in May 1940, I'm going to do it. And then it's also, so that's a really fateful decision. And the second one is his decision to invade Greece. And that is Mussolini, which comes from somewhat of an envy to what Germany's doing, an attempt to show that Italy is, as he said, able to fight the parallel war. We're not just a puppet of Germany. We're not an equal either, but at least a serious player. And I'm going to show this by invading Greece. And of course, he invades it in such a cack-handed way. He doesn't prepare his armed forces. The single most frightening meeting is there's the transcript of Mussolini and his generals talking about the invasion of Greece just a few days before. The transcript survives. It's the most amateurish strategy hour. And it's more like, where will we have our parades to celebrate? You might say a bit like, what will we do when we get to Kiev in 3 days?
That's exactly what I was thinking about.
I heard it in my head, too.
And I want us to come back. He does another thing, too, which, one sort of vignette from the war, which I've always found fascinating, is that Hitler, who usually stayed in Germany, goes on this tour to meet with Pétain after France has fallen, with Franco, and with Mussolini. Yep. And he goes in a train. Do you know what the name of the locomotive was? America.
No, really?
Yeah, I mean, because Hitler, and you capture this, he has this very weird sort of bipolar view of the United States as being this kind of mongrel nation on the one hand, but this incredible industrial power that is Germany's rival, so they're building the America bomber or whatever. But what he wants to do is he wants to bring Pétain into the war, and he wants to bring Franco into the war. And the thing that really, one of the things that scuppers it is the Italians want large chunks of French North Africa, and Pétain and those guys are not willing to go along with it. And you do have to think what might have happened if Vichy France were even more hostile to Britain than it actually was at the time, because there was still a large chunk of the French fleet that was around, and they hated the British, and so he makes that mistake too. So that makes it an interesting case.
Well, the Greek campaign figures prominently in one of the middle chapters.
Yep.
Will you talk us through it?
Well, the Greek campaign it's one of those where I think shows Churchill's quite sense as a war leader at that point of the war, and Mussolini losing it. So Mussolini decides, okay, I want to show I am an independent conqueror, and I'm going to invade Greece. I'm not going to tell Hitler till just before. It's going to be the way Hitler treats me with disdain. He invades countries. He doesn't tell me before he invades them. I'm going to do the same thing to Hitler. So I'm going to go invade. He's going to set the invasion for early 1941, is the plan. And so the idea was that he will announce to Hitler, and then they will march in and he will take it over. And he assembles a force that is not nearly strong enough to do it. It's not well equipped enough. It's not terribly motivated enough, though interestingly his generals are telling them this force is great. We talk about leadership.
Oh, interesting.
So they tell, oh, yes, El Duce. Even though the generals themselves don't know. I mean, it's a fascinating thing about how information goes up the line. So the lead general, Badoglio, actually tells the foreign minister, who's Mussolini's son-in-law, we're not ready, we can't do this. And Ciano passes along Badoglio's message to Mussolini. Mussolini's like, that's not right, he's never told me that. Calls Badoglio, and Badoglio says, oh yes, of course we could invade. So no one will tell him the truth to his face, and he forces it on, and he invades Greece, and it's a catastrophe. So for the Italians, they just cross the border. It's one of the best days in Greece is, I think, the day they call No Day. And that's the day when the Greek government said no to Mussolini when he said, I am invading. And so even today. And before you know it, the Greeks are pushing the Italians back into Albania, because Albania is the Italian colony. And so they're really pushing to get the Italians out. And eventually Hitler has to intervene. Now, in the meantime, the British have started coming to Greece's aid, and they deploy quite a large force. And Churchill, who is a fanatic about the Mediterranean, this is something he wants to hold Greece if he at all can. And I think it's a very telling thing that when he understands they're not going to hold Greece, he just gets out.
And he's willing to liquidate it. Churchill is, I think your depiction of him is, in a way, is a more tragic figure. I think partly maybe why I find him attractive, and a deeper character. I mean, one of the things that's so interesting about your view of FDR, we were talking about this morning as we were driving in, is, there's this view of FDR as, I forget who was it who said, second-rate intellect, first-rate temperament. Whereas Churchill seems the altogether deeper figure. And it's echoed in things like Isaiah Berlin's essay about Churchill in 1940, where he makes the comparison with Roosevelt. Could you say a little bit more about your take on Churchill? Because it's a somewhat more charitable take than some of the historians have written about him recently.
Churchill just grows up very late, I think, is what turns. But for the first chapter, I have two chapters on each of the leaders before. The first chapter on Churchill is long before the First World War, because he has a long experience of war, as you know. I mean, Churchill fights in India, he fights in Sudan.
Prisoner of war.
He fights in the Boer War. He has this all experience. And the early Churchill I really don't like.
that comes through, by the way.
It's very much all about the glory of war. He even says at one point in the Sudan, oh, if only more of my men had died, it would be more glorious. I really don't like the early Churchill, because it's all boyish. This boyish notion of war and glory, which he's doing for his own personal advancement. And Churchill wants a political career. And that sort of is there at the beginning of the First World War. I think that's where the First World War makes a massive difference for Churchill, is when he has the Gallipoli disaster, which he carries the can for. He leaves the government and he goes to the Western Front. And he spends, very luckily for him, I mean, he hadn't planned it, he just is in between two large battles, so he survives. He very easily could have gotten killed. But he's at the Western Front from December 1915 till May, June 1916, so right before the Somme begins. And what he sees is, oh, war's not romantic. War's not beautiful. It's bodies stuck into trenches. It's people killed by accident. There's occasional shell. And he's horrified by just the everyday attrition of war. And he comes back from that as a grown-up, mature thinker. And what he actually does is, don't want British soldiers to die. So he says, this is a mug's game to go over the top. He doesn't like the Somme. He doesn't like Passchendaele. He's desperately unhappy with the way the army is fighting from that point. And he tries to come up with a strategy, and he begins to put it into place in 1918 as Minister of Munitions, of providing the British, a bit like Roosevelt did, with lots of equipment as a way to reduce manpower losses. So I actually think Churchill shows an enormous growth.
So I'm, as both of you know, more of a fanatical Churchillian than anybody else I know. I mean, I take some of what you say, although I think it's actually very rewarding to read his early books, like The Story of the Malcan Field Force, The River War. There are large elements in there which are not romantic at all. And where, among other things, he has this great passage in The Story of the Malcan Field Force, which is this punitive expedition that doesn't accomplish a whole lot. He talks about, and he has this kind of wonderful sort of ironic tone. He said, well, they're these political officers, and they end up negotiating deals with these people, like bandit to bandit. And the rest of us all want to, go have a fight. But what you can see is that he understands, actually, that is imperial management, and that is what you need to do. He also, and again, here I would just push a little gently. I think the World War I experience, I agree with you, absolutely critical, but there's everything else about his experiences that lead up to the war, to include his historical writings. We were talking about the Marlborough, which is a phenomenal, it's a biography of the Duke of Marlborough, his great ancestor, but it's also a phenomenal meditation on coalition warfare.
Yeah.
Oh, interesting.
And you can't, it is so worth reading. Because that's what he's doing in his late 20s, early 30s. He's thinking about what is it like to run what was indeed a global war, because Marlborough was doing that, and he does it very well. But let's flip back to Roosevelt, who we seem to keep on. We're leaving poor Hitler and Stalin out in the cold a bit. Yeah. Would you agree that Roosevelt is in some ways shallow, and if that is the case? If he's not an intellectually particularly deep guy, don't you need to be an intellectually deep guy or gal to be a great strategist?
Why? Very clever people make very stupid choices, and they often tie themselves up in knots. I think what Roosevelt has is a certain foundational beliefs on how wars are won that go back to Mahan. I mean, he is a Mahanite, but what I think he does very well is he integrates air power into Mahanite paradigm. So he starts with the sea power view, which completely influences him until air power comes about, and he says, okay, this actually is sort of the same thing, and I'm going to work within the paradigm of sea and air power. It's not terribly complicated, but why do we wish it to be complicated? I mean, it's what it isn't is he doesn't take risks, because he has a foundational belief on how the war will be won. Hitler takes risks. That's not a good thing.
So I want to circle back to this point about ideology, because it kept coming up for me in the book. Dictators can afford lots of casualties because they have control over the societies. In a way, democratic leaders always have to continue to win the argument. And second, they're less grandiose about the risks they take because they have to win the political argument. And I'm curious why ideology, you say towards the end of the book that if you stopped at Yalta, Stalin would be the best strategist. But after Yalta, he overplays his hand with the occupation, and it seems to me innocent of consideration that Soviet power was inherently expansionist.
I mean, in some ways, I entirely agree. His ideology kicks in and brings him down. That Stalin seems to be constantly at war between a very practical and a very ideological side. And there's no, they're both there all the time. The practical side dominates when Hitler attacks in 1941 because he needs it to. So he instantly opens up the United States. He said, I will take whatever you give me. Please give me everything you can. He cultivates Roosevelt. I don't want to say he's obsequious to Roosevelt, but he's very considerate of Roosevelt.
Offers that the U.S. can command Soviet forces if we'll join the fight.
But he does do these things.
Yeah.
And then by 45, he's all of a sudden, I've won. And then you see the far more ideological Stalin Bolshevik come out again, and he's really unnecessarily aggressive with Roosevelt. I actually think his performance at Yalta, because people think, he's powerful, he gets what he wants. But actually, he's sowing the seeds of the Cold War, which he didn't need to do.
He's ticking everybody off.
Yeah.
But there's also, there's the Stalin of the run-up to World War II.
Yep.
So that would be the same Stalin who first purges his military and kills some of his best generals. It's the Stalin who insists on a forward deployment of forces that's going to lead to them being, over 1 million men getting killed, wounded, or above all captured. And of course, most of them aren't going to come back from those prisoner of war camps. It's the same guy who refuses to believe really detailed warnings from his own intelligence services and from the Brits that this is coming. So how does a guy who makes all those gargantuan mistakes, and they are gargantuan, becomes a good strategist until Yalta, and then he becomes a bad strategist?
Because he becomes a good strategist when he has no alternative. But Hitler can't do that, and that would be the difference. Hitler remains wedded to his vision, whereas Stalin is, I called him the worst and best, because he is the worst from 1939 to 1941 of the grand strategists. He literally sets himself up to be almost conquered, that he helps Hitler. But it's what he does in returning the First World War in Tsaritsyn. He actually is disastrous as a commander in Tsaritsyn.
You bring that out really nicely.
Yeah.
But then, ultimately, he's got to be practical about it. And he learns to be practical in certain counts.
It strikes me that Hitler, in ways, the reverse of that, because he is absolutely brilliant in how he takes power, how he manages to get back the Rhineland, he manages the Anschluss with Austria, certainly all the way up through Munich. He is brilliant. He is a risk taker. That I think is there you're absolutely right. There he's very different from Roosevelt. Although Roosevelt does take a risk by sending the entire fleet to Hawaii, away from its West Coast bases, where it's a lot more exposed, as subsequently found out. What do you think happened to Hitler? This guy who is capable of very... I have my own kind of Shakespearean explanation, which is this happens to every dictator, that they, after a bunch of successes, they kind of lose the things that have been restraining them thus far.
The description you open the book with of the weirdness of his Spartan surroundings and vegetarian dinner and the conversation is really powerful.
The thing about Hitler, I think, is that he doesn't have the humility experience early on that, say, Stalin had to know he needed to be practical. Hitler has too much success, and therefore he becomes totally convinced of his own rightness. And when things turn against him, the first time they turn against him is the Battle of Britain. He refuses to accept that he failed. He doesn't learn. I can't be wrong, I can't be wrong. It really wasn't because of me. I'm going to go and make it all right by invading the Soviet Union. And then when that doesn't work out, he refuses to actually take any of the blame. So he doubles down on his own genius. And it might be because of what you said. He had all that success. And he didn't think he could actually admit to weakness. And that's why he is a failure as a grand strategist. That he could have done things, I think, very differently at these moments of crises. But in fact, what he does is he refuses to admit he needs to change. One
of my favorite parts of the book is when you describe the meeting between Roosevelt and Churchill that results in the Atlantic Charter. Will you spool that out? Because it's such a good part of the book.
In terms of in 1940, you mean? I'm sorry, 1939. The Atlantic Charter meeting, or which one? Or the... I'm trying to think, because they meet so many times.
Where Churchill is desperate to bring American forces into the war, and Roosevelt ruthlessly extracts from him the end of imperial trading privilege, the commitment to self-determination. It's so colorful in the way you talk us through it in the book.
It's Roosevelt, I think, at his most manipulative best. I mean, Roosevelt might not be deep, but he's profoundly manipulative. And the thing about Roosevelt, it's a bit what people, so we're getting very literary, said about Samuel Taylor Coleridge. I had dinner with Coleridge. It was the greatest night. He laughed at my jokes. He said witty things. But then Coleridge just treated them, went off and all of that. I think that was Roosevelt. Roosevelt, you would have dinner with Roosevelt, you'd talk to Roosevelt, you'd think he's listening to me, he loves me. And then Roosevelt would very coldly analyze what he got from that relationship. And that's what he's doing in the Atlantic Charter. When he has this meeting with Roosevelt, with Churchill, Churchill wants the U.S. in the war. That's all really he wants. Whereas Roosevelt has a number of political goals in mind, and that he wants to not commit to going into the war without the U.S. being fired on first. He wants to be able to say to the American people, we are fighting this war not to defend the British Empire, which was a charge made in the First World War, which really had impact. And so, in a sense, when they go to they get together in Canada, Roosevelt gets Churchill to sign the Atlantic Charter, which is anti-imperial, to say all these things, and it's all over. And Churchill goes, "Well, what did I actually get out of this?" And he got nothing.
Yeah.
So what I think makes Churchill such a great strategist, though,
Yeah.
if you go carefully through the documents, it's clear he gets nothing. That is so not the public perception, because Churchill understands he has a political necessity to keep British morale up and threaten Germany with America joining the war. And the way he does that is exquisite.
Yeah. I mean, in some ways, of course, he goes to the British people who do like the values of the Atlantic Charter.
Right.
So that does appeal to a lot of the British people.
And throughout, I mean, even the earliest phases of the war, he is always talking about the United States and talking to the United States. I mean, that he grasps that central fact very, very early on. So it's the whole world, including the United States, including that, and he goes off on that riff. The thing is, I think one of the many strengths of the book is you portray Roosevelt as what he was, which is a very cold character, a very mistrustful character. I mean, he may have trusted Leahy, but he had, I forget whether it was the Army had the incoming messages, the Navy had the outgoing messages in the White House, so that he's the only one who actually knows everything that's going on. Yeah. He can have people who are devoted to him, like Hopkins, and then when they're no longer useful, they're gone. If you really go to Roosevelt, first of all, anyone he meets after he becomes president, he never fully trusts. It's people he knows earlier in his career. Lewis Strauss hugely trusts him because he's early in the career. Leahy he meets in 1913, before he is Franklin Roosevelt. I don't think he actually trusts anybody he meets from 32 onwards.
That's interesting.
And that he does meet Hopkins earlier in New York State, and I think that matters. Hopkins comes and works for him in New York State before he's president. But he has this ability, Roosevelt, as you're saying, to make people think he's their friend and make people think he'll do what they want. But then they'll realize that, he hasn't done it, and he hasn't made a commitment. In the book, I talk about when he first meets Josephus Daniels, which I think is the quintessential Roosevelt in action moment. Josephus Daniels becomes the Secretary of Navy under Woodrow Wilson. He's a power in the Democratic Party. This is a 1912 election, and Roosevelt is really junior in the Democratic Party, and he knows Daniels really matters. He wants to cultivate Daniels. And they meet at the Democratic National Convention. I don't know what happened, but basically he must have just lathered Daniels in praise. Daniels writes about it years later in his memoirs, and he calls it FDR and JD love at first sight. I mean, it's really quite touching. That's actually in Josephus Daniels' memoirs. And when and it works, because when Daniels becomes Secretary of the Navy, he demands from Wilson, who doesn't like Franklin Roosevelt. Wilson's always a bit skeptical about Roosevelt. He demands that he has Roosevelt as his assistant secretary. But we do know what Roosevelt actually thought, because he wrote a letter to Eleanor that night. And he called Daniels the silliest looking hillbilly he'd ever seen. That was his reaction to Daniels, was this hillbilly, this silly, whereas Daniels believed he loved him.
Yeah, he's a little bit more like LBJ than we'd like to think, you know, who also did that.
Yeah.
Of course, Josephus Daniels also famous for making the U.S. Navy dry.
Yeah.
He's the guy who banned alcohol. Listen, we've got three historians sitting around the table who also are very deeply engaged in the affairs of today. So I was wondering if we could carry this forward a bit, and the three of us might talk a bit about how the kinds of things that you discuss here so well reverberate today with the people we see, both early experiences of war, but also these kind of aspects of character, and how important they are, particularly as opposed to institutional considerations when we think about strategy. So all the three of us are obsessed with Ukraine, in particular, though we can also talk about Israel, I suppose, if you want. So maybe, Phil, you want to start us off?
I'm happy to defer to Kori. I mean, I'll start with Putin, because I think Putin can fit very well within this paradigm, both in terms of the fact that he makes the decisions. If you want to go back to the most stunning moment right before the invasion, it's Putin's public press conference, or with his government officials, who clearly don't want to invade Ukraine. These are high functionaries in the state. The bureaucracy is very uneasy about this. And Putin publicly humiliates them. And basically they crack. On TV you could see these people cracking. He's going to have the invasion. That's what I mean. Ultimately we talk about, is it a bureaucracy? I don't think the Russian bureaucracy wanted to invade Ukraine. Vladimir Putin wanted to invade Ukraine. And why does Putin do it? What's his early war experience? It's the Cold War. He's a KGB agent. He is trying to put together a new version of the Soviet Union. And he refers to it. Or Imperial Russia. This comes from his early experiences. So he is trying to relive or recreate what he understands is the proper paradigm by steamrolling his system.
So given how early, 2002, Putin begins to telegraph that ambition, what does it say about all of us as Western strategists that it takes so long to realize that and to take action?
By the way, I think this is the moment to quote George W. Bush saying, I looked deeply into his soul. Yeah. And John McCain said, I looked deeply into his soul and I saw three letters, KGB.
Yeah. It's quite simply that the United States was so secure it didn't really want to worry. I mean, I think that explains a lot about the relationship with Russia. Yeah. That they just didn't feel they had a security issue in Europe, or a really big one. They didn't want a crisis if they didn't want to, so they would always try to put it off. Well, Crimea, well, Donbass.
But see, I guess here, in a way, I think this speaks more, in a way, Kori, to your point about ideology. And about belief systems, which seem to us irrational. Believing that you can reconstruct the Russian Empire. I mean, he doesn't want to reconstruct the Soviet Union. He does want to reconstruct some version of the Russian Empire. We find it very hard to wrap our head around the idea that, you can have people who are the leaders of major countries who are perfectly comfortable risking a very, very large war with all that entails because of an objective which strikes us as irrational. So, I mean, what is so interesting in retrospect about, so many interesting things about the pre-war crisis, is the knots into which highly intelligent observers in the United States and Europe tie themselves in order to convince themselves, well, this all has to do with how we handled NATO expansion. Yep. Or, I mean, wasn't NATO expanding, it's countries wanting to get into NATO, which is actually a very different thing.
Desperately clawing their way into security.
Because they understood Russia better than we did. And that I think is one of the lessons. You can have people out there who are making consequential strategic choices who have value systems utterly at odds with ours, and you can't talk them out of it, and you can't bargain them out of it. I mean, you can think about a lot of things, including our Iran policy, for example.
So to connect the strategist to Ukraine, I mean, this business about risk tolerance and intolerance, I think, is the defining characteristic of American strategy since the invasion.
Yep.
And an anxiety that allows Russia to make incredibly dangerous statements that intimidate us when we're actually the strong ones in this equation. We have talked ourselves into passivity. How would the strategists of your excellent book, what would they do differently?
The good guys, that is.
At least the good guys. We know what the bad guys would do.
Yeah, we're not particularly interested. What would Mussolini do about Vladimir Putin?
I mean, I don't know. It is interesting. They've been talking about leadership and experience, that Biden is clearly also influenced by the Cold War. And Biden was actually a dove in the Cold War. And he was a believer, and he was worried about Soviet escalation in the Cold War. And that seems to have translated over. What would the strategists we know have done in the Cold War? I think they would have both, if both the Democratic ones, be they Churchill and Roosevelt, have been more hardline sooner. It's not to say to begin with they would have been that different.
Yeah.
I think that they both would have, because they both would have been heavily influenced, I think, like Biden was, by the reports that Ukraine had no chance. And therefore, they wouldn't have been throwing everything into Ukraine if the idea was Ukraine wasn't going to survive. I think both of them, however, would have understood this was a situation, as Eliot said, where Russia has shown itself to be very weak and deferring to it, as the United States is constantly deferring to Russia, actually, in its treatment of Ukraine. I can't believe either of them would be doing it 2.5 years after the invasion occurred. And that would be the difference.
No, and I think, to say, certainly in the case of Churchill,
Yeah.
Who begins the 30s with not liking Hitler, but sort of understanding where he's coming from and what he's appealing to in Germany. Certainly by the time, once you get, I would say, certainly past the occupation of the Rhineland in 1936, this guy is dangerous and we need to stop him. And you would have had that with Putin, I think, because of Chechnya, because of Georgia, because of Syria. And the thing that's astonishing to me is all those things happen, and we can't add 2 + 2. So that is what we're dealing with. And I agree with you also about Biden. I think he is very much a creature of a certain view of the Cold War, which explains this obsession with escalation. Now, people, of course, were in the middle of a presidential campaign, and people wonder about Kamala Harris, who has not been in a war, even a Cold War, although I have to think a lot of that generation, and I've even written a little bit about it, as have you, Kori, in The Atlantic, is things are colored by their views of the Iraq War.
Yep.
And, I wonder if you're going to see a lot of people drawing mistaken lessons from that. I know, Kori, since you have a lot of experience in government, what do you think?
Oh, I absolutely think that's right. I mean, Bob Gates' point about Biden being wrong on every national security issue for the last 19 years. He believed Iraq could be broken up into sectarian cantonments. He believed it about Afghanistan. He believed it about the former Yugoslavia. And so he does have a mindset that drives strategy. I just think it's unduly concerned. Grant has this wonderful passage in his memoirs where he's critical of Secretary of War Stanton. And he says he could see all our deficiencies, but he could not see that the South was losing the war. And I think
Great line, actually.
Biden.
That's right. I don't.
It's a great line.
It's very interesting. Yeah.
And I think about that a lot when I think about Biden administration strategy. They're so anxious about our own deficiencies, but they don't make the moves, the assertive moves that would correct it. For example, it is crazy that with the shortfall of munitions and weapon systems, that a president who values good union jobs and needs the politics of the states that produce them has not invoked the Defense Industry Act and poured money into that. I mean, Roosevelt would have done that by about 1936, right?
Well, he does it in 1934 when he becomes president. First thing he does.
I think that's actually one of the very important points I've heard you make now several times, Phil, that it's not like the United States begins rearming after Pearl Harbor.
No.
This had been in train 7 years before.
Yep.
I mean, it really comes along in a big way in 1940, but even in 38.
37, 38.
Yeah. And that is something. It's interesting to speculate a little bit what happened. I mean, Trump, who knows? If Kamala Harris became president, what sort of strategist would she be? And I guess the hypothesis I would throw out is that the most important experience in this case would actually be her professional experience as a prosecutor, that thinking in terms of perpetrators and victims and making the case and bring them to justice, which is not a bad mindset. It's not everything that you need, but it's it is something. There is a case, Phil, that I think somebody would make. We're almost out of time here. We may need to wrap up with this. People would say, well, look, I take your point about the strategists, but all five of them, including Mussolini, were extraordinary personalities, much larger politicians than what you see today. And so that's the argument that once upon a time giants, including bad giants, walked the earth. What do you make of that argument?
I tend to think we look at leaders in the past and assume that they are, in some ways, greater than the people are now, and I just wonder if that's partly an overstatement of that. I mean, we were talking about how Stalin was viewed at the time, and the great description of Stalin actually comes from the poet who said he's basically an enormous flea. To understand Stalin, he's no genius. He's not like he's this seminal thinker. He's just this horrible flea, 1,000 times bigger than any other flea. And I wonder, Hitler is not a great thinker in any way. In many ways, he's a bit crazy, but then he's able to use his craziness in certain times through the Great Depression to do things. So, I mean, I just wonder whether we just need to be careful that they just happen to be the five in charge. And if you are going to be president to a certain degree, you do have some great skills. But another president could have been as effective as Roosevelt, or less effective, or more. I don't want to overstate that.
Kori, any final thoughts?
I think one of the lessons I take from history is that events drive major decision, and people lose wars when they don't have good strategists at the helm. And that great line from Bismarck about God having a special providence for drunks, babies, and the United States of America. We get George Washington, Abraham Lincoln, and Franklin Roosevelt. And wow, we're so lucky, because the trajectory of American history would be so different if you don't have those three people who meet the moment when the moment is urgent.
Yeah, I think we all probably would agree with that. This has been a wonderful conversation. Write another book, and we'll do that. And
Well,
you too, Kori.
We have another book coming out soon. So
we'll do this again. But
Congratulations on the book, Phil.
Yes, congratulations, and thank you all for joining us.
thank you.